Hey guys, and welcome to the in-depth analysis video of game number 4 of my best of 5 finals match against fellow Grandmaster Ian Weinstein from the 2024 Scrabble Players Championship held in South Bend, Indiana. If you guys have been following along this week, you know that Ian jumped out to a 2-0 lead in this best of 5 match. I was able to win game 3 in come from behind fashion to force a game 4 and keep my hopes of winning the title alive. But the task was far from over, as I would still need to win this game 4 to force a decisive game 5. And as you guys will see, it was quite a game. Let's jump right in. Ian was first in this game and started with an S and a blank on his opening rack. He actually doesn't have any available bingos here, but understandably spent a couple minutes convincing himself of that fact, since whenever you have an S and a blank on your rack, especially with a couple E's, it certainly feels like you should have a bingo, and you really don't want to start off a game by missing a bingo. In any case, Ian played Eek for 14 points, which looks like the right idea, getting rid of his clunky K as well as 2 of his 3 E's, and keeping the super bingo-prone EIS blank for his next turn. It is interesting, though, to think about different placements for the word Eek. Ian played it here with the second of the 2 E's in Eek on the star. He could also have considered playing it here with the first of the 2 E's on the star. Both of these plays have some defensive drawbacks, as Eek takes both front and back hooks. If you play Eek where Ian did, with the second E on the star, then you have to worry about me putting a letter in front of the word Eek and playing a 7-letter word down the E column, possibly even covering both double word scores. In front of Eek, you can put a D for Deek, an L for leak, or a P for peak. Notice that Ian does have a blank, but he doesn't have any of those actual letters on his rack. If, on the other hand, Ian were to play it over here, Eek takes a back D for Eeked and a back S for Eeks. Notice, though, that this time Ian does have one of these hooks, namely the S on his rack. So for that reason, I actually would have a slight preference for playing it in this spot. The logic being, if either way you're giving a significant amount back to your opponent in terms of hooks in a double-double line, you might as well at least set it up so that you have the hook. The computer does agree with Ian's placement of Eek over here, simming just under 1% below the more aggressive placement of Eek over here. It's not a big difference, but it's still interesting to think about. In any case, like I said, Ian placed it over here, and let's see what happened next. My first rack was very vowel heavy, 3 A's, an E, and an I, along with a P and an X. I noticed immediately that I had the front P hook to make peak, but there aren't a lot of great plays there. I could play Paya, which is a little bit of an X setup, maybe trying to draw an I for XI down the F column with Axe for 50 points on my next turn, but the problem is it's extremely dangerous, because Paya takes a lot of back hooks. Pile with an L, Payan with an N, and Payas with an S are all valid. And if Ian is able to play there and start a 7-letter word horizontally, he's going to get a double-double and get close to 100 points. So that's a risk I'm not willing to take in this position. Instead, I opted to play off my X with Axe for 28 under the K and the E of Eek, scoring a bit more, and retaining a lead that's a little bit vowel-heavy, but does at least contain the P, which could be useful for the P hook on my next turn. This seems like the right decision. Ian, fortunately for me, drew about as poorly as he could have to his really strong leaf of EIS blank, pulling AUU on a 3-tile pool out of the bag. There's really not a lot for Ian to do on the board here. He could play Sao for 16 points, keeping EIU blank, which if he pulls some more vowels out of the bag, could really result in a tenuous situation. So instead of that, he makes what I believe is the wise decision here, trading 4 tiles back to the bag, starting afresh with ES blank, hoping to get some better luck on his next pull, and finally get his bingo down on his 3rd turn. I also drew some more vowels, but fortunately have a pretty clear play here. With 3 A's and a U, I used my P for peak to get rid of a bunch of these vowels with Powa for 22 points, keeping the pretty well-balanced AIN lead. There isn't much else to consider here, and I was glad to finally have a fairly easy decision after some brutal turns earlier in the series. In any case, I jump out to a 50-14 lead, but it's short-lived, as Ian draws well to his exchange, and he's got several available bingos here. His highest scoring one would be the nice Svelter. Not too often you see a word starting with SV, above Peak and Axe, making Scott and Vex for 83 points. But he doesn't do this, mostly because it gives back a large scoring option on the 8 row under the E and the R. For instance, let's say I have an F for EF, or an H for EH, as well as an E to go under the R for RE. I could easily play a 4-letter word under that E and that R for close to 50 points. So Ian doesn't want to let that happen, and instead makes what I believe is a smart decision here, sacrificing 3 points to play Varlets and Axel for 80, which significantly restricts my bingo percentage by putting the V out in open space. The V is a very defensive tile in Scrabble because it makes no 2-letter words, and it also doesn't give back any glaringly obvious scoring plays. So I think this is a very prudent 3-point sacrifice on Ian's end. He takes a 94-50 lead. And right here, guys, if you were watching the live broadcast, there was a very dramatic moment. With this rack, AFGINOT, I immediately saw the 7-letter word of anti-fog on my rack and put it in that order so that the whole world could see it. However, I took a long time to play the word, and everybody watching was extremely perplexed because it plays very nicely for 82 points on the left side of power. Well, the reason I didn't play it quickly, as I explained afterwards, is because I simply didn't see the spot. And I know that sounds crazy, like after all this just makes 2 other words. So what happened here? I don't have a great explanation, honestly, for what happened, but I think partially it's because the AUA in Power looks deceptively hard to overlap. Most overlaps are alternating vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. With AUA, 3 vowels next to each other, it sort of feels like you need 3 consonants in a row to start the word to overlap them. But that isn't the case here because the A can go before the A to make AA. And for some reason, I think I just didn't register that as a viable spot in my head. And I actually was dangerously close to playing fasting for 30 points through the S and varlets. I even lined this up on my rack, getting ready to play it, which would have been a horrendous mistake. Easily the biggest mistake of this series, and probably my biggest mistake of the tournament. Thankfully, though, as I was about to play this, I took one last look at the board and realized that anti-fog fit over here for 82 points. So I quickly rearranged my rack, put this down, shook my head a couple of times to, I think, the bewilderment of the viewers and the commentators, but yeah, that's what happened, guys, in case you were wondering. If I saw this, I would have played it immediately. I just flat out didn't see this for like 2 minutes. Again, I saw the word, I just didn't see the spot. Weird lapse, but like I said, thankfully I caught myself before I hit my clock because that would have been a really brutal mistake to try to rebound from. But in any case, I got it down 132-94. I have the lead. Ian draws the Q and a pair of S's along with some vowels, and fortunately for him, Anti-Fog gives him a great bailout play with Cheese for 47 points. You may be wondering why Ian didn't just play Chi for 43 points, since this holds the S and only scores 4 fewer points. Normally we say S's are worth about 8 to 10 points, so this seems like a better play. The reason is twofold. Number one is that Ian has 2 S's, and the second S doesn't add that much value to the first S. Number two is that by playing Cheese, Ian also at least mostly obstructs the G in Anti-Fog. He now takes out the triple-triple possibility and forces me to start with the G if I want to play there. If he had just played Chi, I could still fit a triple-triple through that G, or a word that has the G in the second or third spots. Now I have to start with the G, which is considerably harder. This is definitely the right decision for Ian if you ask me, as well as if you ask the computer. I drew the second blank out of the bag after my bingo, which is always a welcome sight, but this was far from a straightforward turn. I at first didn't actually see a bingo, and it turns out there is no 7 available here, but then I looked a little bit closer at the V and varlets and noticed Marveler for 64. However, I didn't play this immediately, because I knew that after Ian's play of Cheese on his last turn, he had another S. Like we talked about before, from his perspective, Cheese only made sense over Chi for just 4 extra points because he had a second S in reserve. So I knew pretty much guaranteed that Ian had a second S when he played Cheese, and thus Marveler is pretty risky, because it takes an S, of course, for Marvelers, and Ian could have a bingo or other very high-scoring play down the O column with that S on one of those 2 triple word scores. So I actually gave some consideration to not bingoing here, and doing one of 2 things. One other option I looked at was burning the blank for Extremer from the EX down the H column, scoring 51 points and retaining the L. Normally this is way worse than Marveler, as it's 13 fewer points, and the L is pretty neutral as far as a leave goes, but I knew that not exposing that dangerous S-hook had a lot of value. Was it worth 13 points of value, though? Another thing I considered was playing even shorter with something like Real or Realm through the A and varlet's overlapping Rex. But I quickly discarded this. It's simply too big a point sacrifice. I felt even Extremer for 51, scoring 35 or so more than my plays through the A, was worth burning the blank. So I was really between Extremer and Marveler. Ultimately, 13 felt like a little bit too much to sacrifice, despite, like I said, giving back potentially big X plays to Ian with Marvelers. Because even if I know pretty much he has an S, there's no guarantee he's going to have a bingo there. And there's also no guarantee, even if he doesn't have a bingo, that he's going to have a super high scoring play. For what it's worth, the Macondo engine does agree with my decision here. If I sim Marveler versus Extremer, providing that Ian is guaranteed to have another S on his rack, Macondo still prefers Marveler despite opening the big S hook. So it does seem it was worth thinking about this play, but I made the right call ultimately, deciding that 13 was a little bit too much to justify sacrificing simply to not create this hook. Let's see if Ian capitalized. Thankfully for me, he drew more vowels after cheese, and of course he still had his S, but he had 5 vowels to go with it. And he reluctantly burned his S with audios for 37 points here. I was actually very happy to see this come down, because, like I said, I knew pretty much that he had an S after cheese, and for him to use it for only 37 points as opposed to a 50-plus point play or even a bingo was actually a relief for me, because now I didn't have to worry about any more big plays in that spot in the future. I think this is the right call for Ian here. His plays that retain the S are just so weak. He could do something like Guide, but that only scores 21, and AOS isn't even really that strong a leave. So I think he's correct here. Burn through some more tiles, score 37 points, get himself pretty close to my score, and hope to get a more balanced rack, including some scoring tiles on his next turn. I drew a very bizarre-looking rack after my bingo, a J, 2 O's, an R, 2 U's, and a Y. I actually have a bunch of options here, all of which are fairly ugly, so the question becomes which of these is the least ugly. The main ones I considered were Jury for 32 hooking Taj, keeping the extremely unappetizing OOU, and Soju from the Essen Varlets for 22, so 10 fewer points than Jury, and keeping the also unappetizing ORUY, but at least a little bit more balanced than OOU after Jury. So how do you decide between these two plays? There really isn't a whole lot else to look at. I briefly considered Usury for 16 points. It's too big a point sacrifice, and JOO really is not all that good a leave. I do want to shed this J and try to move towards a bingo rack as soon as possible since the board is fairly wide open at this point. So it was pretty much between Jury and Soju for me the whole time. I really went back and forth a lot between these two plays. At some point I had Jury on my rack ready to go, and then last second I eventually switched to Soju, which is the play I ultimately made. My logic was that yes, I do give up 10 points, but my leave, even though it's not great, is still a lot more palatable than the leave of OOU after Jury. And by keeping the RY together, which go together pretty well, I figure even if I'm not going to bingo, which is still fairly unlikely, I at least will have some decent scoring potential. If I keep OOU after Jury, then even with a mediocre draw, I could very well be looking at an exchange rack. If I draw like IO and pretty much any 2 other tiles, it's going to be really, really hard to keep battling through that. And it could be even worse if I end up drawing 3 vowels out of the bag. After this, even if I draw IO, I can probably plod through it with U or something and at least make something work. So I figured the disaster scenarios were a lot less damaging after Soju. And generally speaking, if it's a fairly close game and the board is pretty open, as it is here, at least for now, I prefer sacrificing a little bit of points for the disaster aversion, since there's nothing worse than there being a wide open board with tons of opportunities, and you have like IOOOUU and can't do anything, and all you can do is trade and pray that your opponent can't crush you, when in all likelihood they will crush you. At least if I have an R and a Y, I should have some ability to hopefully score or play some defense. So I think this is the right call. Interestingly, the computer really struggles to decide between these two plays. Ultimately, Soju sims above Jury by a fraction of a percent, but it's really, really close. Ian drew a fairly clunky rack after playing off 6 tiles with audios. With 2 I's and 2 N's, he pretty quickly made here what appears to be his best play by a good margin, hinnied for 30 points to the D in audios. This is great because it not only scores well, it also turns over 6 tiles, giving Ian a great chance to draw some of the high-scoring tiles, as well as the 1 remaining S in the bag, all of which would be really useful for him. So this is definitely his best play. And now in my next turn, with Ian now within 10 points of my score, I was really starting to feel the scoring pressure. I considered playing something like U above the M in Marvelers for 16 points, because EILR is a very strong bingo leave, but I ultimately decided against this, because the problem with U is I'm blocking my best bingo lines. I'm blocking the 5 row above Marvelers and the 4 row below Hinny. So if I don't have a great spot to bingo with EILR, the leave's utility goes out the window. Because if I'm not going to bingo with this leave, then I'm not going to score with it. 1-point tiles aren't going to get me a lot of points without a bingo. So if I'm going to close the board, I actually want to keep tiles like the Y that are a little bit better for scoring. So this play is very anti-thematic in that sense. So instead, I looked at a couple of plays that scored well immediately with the Y and kept the board a bit more open for bingos. Specifically, I was looking at Gluey and Gorally from this G. These do look like my two best options by a good amount. Ultimately, I went with Gorally, because while it does keep the U, it also keeps the E, and with the number of E's dwindling, there are only 4 of them left at this point. I really wanted to make sure not to run out of E's. And the good thing is there are no U's left, so I know that this is the last U I'm going to get. Having 1 U is not actually that bad. It's more that when you have 2 U's, it's such a nightmare. That's part of why the U is such a bad tile to keep. But since I know I'm not going to be getting a second U, it doesn't really scare me all that much. I also know the pool is consonant heavy. We're looking at almost twice as many unseen consonants as vowels, 29 consonants, 15 vowels. So keeping 2 vowels doesn't scare me all that much. Bluey is also reasonable, but IOR is really not that great a leave. Without an E, I'm not particularly likely to bingo, and with 3 more I's and 4 more O's left, I was a little bit worried about these vowels getting duplicated, and that would really make this clunky. So I ultimately went with Gorally, which does appear to be the better play. I'm up by 40 points, and with a rack of ADEHILW, Ian actually has a plethora of low 40-point options here. The key thing to notice is that Ian's play of Hinnied on the last turn actually takes a sneaky front hook for Winnied, and he notices this. He considers strongly both Haw for 42 and Lewd for 45. Another cool option actually doesn't involve playing Winnied at all. It's a Weil for 45 points above the Y in Gorally. So lots of interesting options to consider here for Ian. He ultimately went with Lewd, which is a bit of an equity sacrifice over the 42-point Haw, which scores 3 fewer than Lewd but keeps the really nice DEIL, which should yield a lot of bingos. I'm guessing Ian's main concern with Haw was that it creates an S-hook with Haws that could be fairly annoying to block. And with 1 S still unseen, if I have the S after this play, Ian's going to be at a significant disadvantage. Also, if I play either with Haws or on the 5 row, blocking Ian's nice line to play ED above the M and the A in Marvelers, hooking M and Da, then this leave, kind of like I was saying on the last turn, is going to quickly diminish in utility. Since this is a bingo leave, it's not a scoring leave. Ian doesn't keep a lot of high-scoring tiles with DEIL, so if he can't bingo with it, he's probably not scoring with it. And I think that's part of why he ultimately decided to play Lewd, because while AHI is not that likely to turn into a bingo, the H is a really useful scoring tile. Notice too there are several good spots already on this board for the H, such as at 2J on the triple letter score above the I in Winnied playing horizontally, and under the U in Soju making on the double word score horizontally. So I think this is a really heads-up play by Ian, sacrificing some equity, but recognizing that the board is likely not going to stay bingo-friendly for that long, and keeping the H is going to end up being more important than keeping the ED together. I think a Weil is also a reasonable option, but with another W still unseen that I could have picked up for Winnied, I think playing over here, also obstructing some possible bingos, does make a lot of sense. So this is a really tough decision, a lot of reasonable plays, but I think Ian did the analysis perfectly here. It's a tough play to make. I think both Haw and a Weil actually make more intuitive sense, but I think he made the right play here, so really, really smart decision-making from Ian and great awareness of the situation at hand. I drew pretty well after Gorally. I pulled another E as well as an R and a D, but the UV combo is a little bit troublesome. And I have, once again, a lot of mediocre options here. Nothing scores more than about 24 points. The first thing I considered was blowing up the rack with something like Vendu for 24, keeping just an R, or Revenue or Unreave, also for 24, keeping just a D. I considered as well Vend through the N in Winnied, keeping E and RU, once again scoring 24, or sacrificing a couple points to play Uneven through the disconnected N and E for 19. This is actually what I eventually settled on. Even though it's 5 fewer points, I felt DER was a significantly better leave than any of the others. I didn't want to get rid of both of my E's with something like Vendu, because E's were now starting to get very scarce. Remember how I said there were only 4 E's unseen to me before? Now, after Ian's play of Lewd and me having drawn another E, there are just 2 E's remaining. So if I get rid of both of them with Vendu, there's a decent chance I might not see another E for the entire rest of the game, which would be very damaging both to my bingo chances and my overall rack flexibility. So I really wanted to keep one of my 2 E's. So because of that, I was pretty much between Uneven and Vend. Vend is 5 more points, but E and RU really just didn't feel like a good leave. Again, I'm keeping all these 1-pointers. It's not a terrible leave, but there aren't a whole lot of places to bingo on this board, and I didn't want to get stuck with a rack with a bunch of 1-pointers that didn't go well together and didn't offer me any scoring options. So that's why I eventually settled on Uneven. The D and the R go together great, so do the E and the D and the E and the R, and the D at least is a better scoring tile and gives me a lot of flexibility. It's really close, but I think this is a decent call. Ian drew poorly after Lewd. He's got 5 vowels in addition to an H and a T. And here he makes a game-saving decision. Ian's best equity play by far, which he was about to play, was Ohia for 33 points under Soju, making Joe an This scores well and cleans up his rack really nicely, getting rid of one of his 2 O's and one of his 2 I's. However, at the last second, Ian decides to sacrifice a good amount of equity by playing Oh-Ho for 31 points. It's 2 fewer points and it keeps the undesirable doubled I's on his rack, but it doesn't dangle an A in the middle of a triple-triple line, which is really scary for bingos, and also with a Z unseen, I could easily hit something like Zany for almost 80 points. So a really heads-up play by Ian. And like I said, it was a game-saving play, because my next rack was DEFPRRT. If Ian had played Ohia on his previous turn, then I would have tripled with pre-draft through the A for a whopping 185 points. That would have put me up close to 200 and basically ended the game on the spot. So Ian's cautious decision here keeps him in this game. And now I'm faced with a pretty tough rack. I only have 1 vowel which I'd really rather not part ways with, but the problem is my highest scoring play by a big margin is feed for 28 points, which I quickly see. And as much as I like scoring 28 points, I really hate keeping PRRT, drawing into a pool that remains somewhat constant heavy. This is what I did. It's unfortunately a mistake. I missed a really cool play here through the JO on the board. Another FJ word. We saw Fjeld come up in an earlier match. I missed that as a good opportunity, and now I miss Fjord for 18 points, which is much better because it's 10 fewer than feed, but it keeps that super valuable E. Remember last turn how I was talking about how much I wanted to keep an E? It's easily worth 10 points here because not only is EPRT a really good leave, PRRT is a horrible leave. And the difference between a great leave and a horrible leave is easily more than 10 points. So this is a fairly sizable mistake, unfortunately, on my part. So clearly, based on this game and the earlier game, I need to review my FJ words, as that's the second one I've missed just in this final series alone. Let's see how badly I would get punished. Ian had ACIINTW. He doesn't have any particularly exciting options. His 2 best plays appear to be either Wit or Caw, both on the 14 row underlapping JO. Caw scores more, it gets him 27 points, but keeps IINT, which is not a particularly good leave with the duplicated I's. Wit scores 3 fewer, getting Ian 24 points, but keeps a more balanced leave of ACIN. Interestingly, Wit also sets up Ian's A for Hota for possible plays to the triple word on the 15 row. That being said, Ian has to be a little bit careful because there are 3 more A's unseen that I could easily have for my own play there. However, the commentators made a really astute point here. When I just played feed, I could have played the word def, D-E-A-F, through the E in uneven in the same spot. If I had had an A on my rack, I almost certainly would have done that, keeping the E, which is far more valuable than the A. So it seems safe to infer from Ian's perspective that when I played feed, I did not keep an A on my rack. Of course, I could have still drawn one from the bag, but only drawing 3 tiles doesn't give me that good a chance to draw the A. So I think playing Wit here makes sense, especially taking that into account, because I'm relatively unlikely to have an A on my rack. And if somehow this gamble doesn't pay off and I do have an A, it's not the worst thing for Ian, because it's not like I'm going to score 60 there. I might score 30-ish, and if I do that, Ian's still not going to be down that much, and with a decent leave like ACIN, he's got free reign to try to bingo on the left-hand side of the board to one of the letters in Lewd, or with a 7 on the 5 row above the M in Marvelers. So I'm not sure how much of this Ian thought out during the game. I think his logic was more not wanting to keep the 2 I's after a call, which is also very strong logic. I definitely think for both of those reasons, Wit is the correct decision for Ian here. And now, guys, it's my turn, and we come to one of the most pivotal decisions of this series, and really one of the most pivotal turns of my Scrabble career. I had a nightmare draw after feed. I kept PRRT and drew GGZ, leaving myself with 7 consonants. There's really one play I can at all justify considering other than exchanging, and it's GRR for 19 points down the F column. This scores pretty well, but keeps GPTZ on my rack. If I don't do GR, I'm pretty much limited to exchanging. But if I exchange, I have a couple things I could consider. I could consider keeping the Z and maybe trading 6 or 5, keeping Z or RZ, hoping to score well with the Z on my next turn. I could also trade the Z in, keeping something like RT, going more for a bingo. So I considered all of these plays. It's worth mentioning that before Ian played Wit, while I was thinking on his time, I was very much prepared to play Gur, figuring keeping ZG on my rack, if I could draw an A for Zag or an I for Zig, I'd be able to play Zig or Zag with Jog for over 40 points on my next turn. That became quickly moot after Ian played Wit, and I had to quickly recalibrate my decision making. The key thing to keep in mind here, guys, is that even though I'm only down 13 points and I can actually take the lead with Gur, I'm in a deceptively bad position. Because the fact that Ian played Wit into a pool with so many A's pretty much indicates that he's going to have at least one, if not multiple, of those A's. Otherwise, it seems like a fairly foolhardy decision. With 4 A's still unseen, I've got to be operating under the assumption that Ian's got at least one, if not two of them, and he's probably about to score around 30 points there, if not more, on his next turn with a play to the triple. So I'm thinking that on my next turn, Ian's going to be somewhere around 340. So if I play Gur, that means I'm going to be down somewhere around 25 to 30 points, if not a little bit more, holding GPTZ. And while 25 or 30 is not a huge deficit, the problem is it's going to be very difficult for me to unload all of these tiles. If I maybe draw like AE or something, I could hit Gaze on the 5th row, making M above Marvelers. That would just about tie the game, and I'd probably still be left with a fairly constant heavy rack. That's a particularly good scenario, though. I'm not that likely to pull an A and an E, especially one of the E's with only 2 of them unseen. So I didn't really want to count on that happening. And I figured my better bet was to exchange tiles and go for a bingo. Not exchanging keeping the Z, because again, I don't really like the Z on this board. I'm assuming Ian's going to play on the bottom right, take a pretty sizable lead, and there's really nowhere great for me to score with the Z on this board. I think it's more of a liability than an asset. So I made the decision to trade GGPRZ, keeping RT on my rack. Now, this is a very committal decision. I do recognize that, because if Ian scores 30 points on the bottom right and goes up 45, there's pretty much no way I'm coming back in this game and staying alive if I don't hit a bingo. I fully recognize that. That being said, RT is a pretty good leave, and I've got lines to work with. I could draw an 8-letter bingo ending in any of the L, E, or D in Lude, or a 7-letter bingo ending one spot above the M in Marvelers. Now, the one issue I will admit with this plan is that even if I hit a bingo, I'm far from out of the woods. Because remember, if we're operating under the assumption that Ian scores 30 on his next turn, he's going to take about a 45-point lead. If I bingo for like 70 or 75, I might go up around 30. But I'll be opening a lot of new real estate for Ian on the left-hand side of the board that wasn't previously there. And depending on what he draws, he may be able to score quite a lot. And that endgame could really go either way. It's hard to know for sure. So the question is, am I more likely to win by exchanging and then hitting a bingo and then holding on in the endgame, or by taking my 19 with Gur and trying to fight through GPTZ after Ian presumably scores 30 to 35 points on the bottom right? During the game, I decided that the bingo line was more likely to give me the win. I still agree with that decision just because of how awful GPTZ is. I need an amazing draw here, likely at least an A and an E, to bail myself out of this at all. And again, even if I draw Gaze, it's not like that just gives me the win. That more or less ties the game with Ian still on turn. So it's not as if I just go for that and I win. I still have a lot of fighting to do even if I bail out after GPTZ. So it felt like after Gur, I was hoping for a good draw to just bail out of this situation and give me maybe a 50-50 shot. I felt if I traded and I got a good draw, then yes, a bingo doesn't win the game on the spot, but I still felt like I would definitely have the advantage going up around 30 points. So I felt like with trading, I was at least going for something that would give me a promising situation. Gur is going for something that just kind of gets me back into the game. That's sort of what led me to gravitate eventually towards exchanging. It was interesting to see how much criticism and praise on both sides I received for this decision. It was, like I said, one of the most pivotal decisions of this entire match and really of my Scrabble career. So it's been really cool to see what everybody has thought of this play. I've been loving both the positive and negative feedback. I love that kind of dialogue in Scrabble. It's always really cool to see what the different sides think, and it's also really interesting to see how the Macondo engine evaluates this position. Macondo, after a long sim, has the plays basically neck and neck. Both exchanging and playing through with Gur seem to win somewhere in the ballpark of 26% of the time. So Macondo doesn't really decide for us. I find it fascinating that these two plays, so different in their potential paths to victory, win more or less the same amount. It's so hard to decide. Like I said, exchanging is the path I took during the game. It may have been correct. Statistically speaking, it may not have been. We may never know. If you guys have any thoughts in the comments, please share them. Love to hear what you think of this position. Like I said, it's one of the coolest turns I've ever seen. In any case, let's see how it worked out. As predicted, Ian played for around 30 points on the bottom right. With this rack, he made the best play of Acai, scoring 33 points. There's not much else to really consider here for him. It scores well, cleans up his rack. E&O is a very good lead, drawing into what's now a fairly consonant-heavy pool from his perspective. This looks like the clear winner. And amazingly, in a big stroke of luck, I did pull a bingo here. I quickly slapped down cash straight for 74 points to the Ian Lude, and now we're going to see the situation I was talking about before. Just because I managed to draw a bingo does not mean I'm out of the woods, because I go up 369 to 341. But it's Ian's turn, and he now has a C in the triple line, as well as the entire left-hand side of the board to work with. So this is still anybody's game. And this was a super exciting moment, I know, for the commentators and the viewers when I hit the bingo, because now it became a competitive game, and nobody, I don't think, watching this or playing this game, Ian and I think, both had no idea who was going to win this game at this point. If I didn't hit my bingo, then this game was almost certainly going Ian's way. So one of the most fortunate draws I've ever had to hit a bingo after that exchange. And here, pretty quickly, Ian played Compend for a massive 51 points. Interestingly, some of the viewers were second-guessing this play just because it does empty the bag. Emptying the bag is a little bit dangerous because it gives your opponent full knowledge of your rack. There's also the possibility of Ian drawing a ton of consonants and having a hard time unloading them. You'll notice that the pool is extremely consonant heavy. You're only looking at 2 vowels unseen, but 9 consonants. And there's some heavy consonants too. Both B's, 2 G's, a Y, and a Z. Drawing a lot of those could wreak havoc on Ian's flexibility in the endgame and his chances to pull this one out. That being said, I think this play is completely forced. The problem is Ian is down here. He's down 28 points. He's not really in a commanding position. I don't think he can afford to not empty the bag and play off 2 tiles with something like Peen for 21 points over here, or maybe Po for 20 points. Because if he does this, remember, he's still down. He's still going to be down 8 points. And there's a lot of risk. I could hit some massive plays from the C, like cozying, which would score almost 100 and end the game on the spot. So there's actually a lot of value for Ian in blocking the left-hand side of the board. This is simply too many points to pass up. The computer says this is best by a mile. This is best by the mile. Ian played this pretty quickly, and he was correct to do that because I was also under a bit of time pressure at this point, and it put a lot of stress on me for the upcoming endgame. So here we go, guys. This is the endgame. All things considered, for me, a pretty good draw after my bingo. B-G-I-N-O-R-Z. Ian pulls 4 consonants after Compend, and he has a rack of B-E-G-T-Y. I'm down 23, 369 to 392. Now, for context here, I was down to about 4 minutes on my clock when Ian played Compend, like I said, with a lot of speed. And I realized to my horror that my tile tracking was off. I showed Ian as having 3 tiles, just B-G-Y at this point. But I knew, of course, he had 5 tiles, so I desperately and quickly needed to figure out what the remaining 2 tiles were. Like I said, I had about 4 minutes left at this point, but I needed to not only figure that out, but also leave myself time to figure out what would likely be a complicated endgame. So what I did here, this is actually very instructive. I grabbed a brand new unused tracking sheet I had from my folder and tracked the entire game over from scratch. That's a lot faster generally than trying to figure out tile by tile what letters you're missing. And the trick to do this, guys, is to go row by row. So I start with the top row. I quickly track off an L and an A. Then I track off the letters in castrate, a U and another U, then an O, then the letters in Winnie, and so on, row by row, until you'll be left with 5 tiles. I was able to do this process in just about a minute's time. And that might sound really fast, and it is pretty fast. But I still promise you That's much faster than trying to go letter by letter. Because when you go letter by letter, your eyes have to keep darting from one part of the board to the other. Like, let's say I were trying to count how many A's were left. I've got to look at the top left, find the 2 A's in castrate, then I've got to look at the top right, see the A in audios. I've got to look at the bottom now on the left and look at those A's in power and anti-fog. I've got to look at the bottom right to acai. It's really inefficient, and then I'm still only done with one letter. If you go row by row, it's so efficient and doesn't depend on what the ultimate letters are that you're looking for. If you go letter by letter alphabetically and it turns out the remaining letters are a U and a T, it's going to take you a long time to get there. But that is irrelevant if you go row by row. So that's my big tip right here, guys. If you're ever in a time scramble situation, or just a situation in general where you've mistracked badly and you need to know what your opponent has, don't try to fix your existing tracking. Do not do it. It will take you longer. Take a brand new sheet, go row by row, and if you practice this and get good at it, you should, I think, be able to do it within about a minute fairly reliably. So, in any case, that's what I did, and I had just about 3 minutes, maybe a little bit less, still on my clock, when I realized that Ian had B, E, G, T, Y remaining as his 5 tiles. So now I could take a little bit of a deep breath. I figured out what he has, but I still need to figure out how can I win this game. I figured here the key was going to be 2 things. Thing number 1 was I needed to play out in 2 turns. If I take more than 2 turns to play all of my tiles, then Ian is going to get 2 more turns. And with that, he's going to have 2 opportunities to both accumulate points and get rid of some of his clunky consonants. I felt like, given I'm already at a 23-point deficit, I can't afford him that opportunity. So I need to take only 2 more turns so that he only gets 1 more turn. And thing number 2 was I noticed Ian is threatening to score a pretty healthy number of points down the F column next to Power and Anti-Fog with Bay, B-E-Y, making Nub and Te. So that naturally led me to think about going in that spot myself to block it because I also had a B. So I came up with the idea of playing Brig for 27, keeping N-O-Z. Now, I know N-O-Z often can play out with Zone and Zona being words, so I noticed that Zona plays to the A in audios on the top right for a pretty good amount of points, 23 points to be exact. So that looked kind of promising. But then I was like, okay, so Brig puts me up 4 points, Zona would go out for a lot, but what if Ian blocks Zona? He can't score a lot while blocking it, but if he's able to block it, then can I go out elsewhere? Can I even play my Z elsewhere? And that's when I looked on the left-hand side of the board and noticed that I can also play Azon, A-Z-O-N, from the second A in castrate. So if Ian blocks Zona on the top right, then I'm going to be able to go out with Azon and win the game easily, since Ian's best block of Zona scores very little. So now I had to make sure that Zona was enough points, because Ian can still score pretty well by playing the word Gybe, G-Y-B-E, either to the D in Lewd as Gybe, or above the M in Marvelers, hooking E-M. And I did the math and confirmed that Brig would indeed win by 5 points. So let's see how this works in action. I played Brig. Ian made what his optimal play. He played Gybe above the M in Marvelers for 24, so he goes up 20 points. I went out with Zona for 23, got 2 additional points from his unplayed T, winning the game 421 to 416 in extremely intense fashion. There was nothing better for Ian to do on the turn where he played Gybe over here. He can't score anymore, and like I said, if he tries to play something like Vid over here to block Zona, he's only scoring 6 points. It's easy to see I go out with Azon and win by way more. So after Brig, Ian is lost. Brig did win the game. Now, after the game, I couldn't help but wonder, was there another way I could have won besides Brig? And it turns out the answer is yes, with a very similar idea. Another winning line for me would be to spend my C immediately playing Grizz with Nug and Tar for 29. This leads to a fairly similar sequence. Ian's best play once again is just to play Gybe for 24. He would take an 18-point lead and I'd be left with B and O. My highest scoring outplay would be the sneaky Knob hooking AA to make Ba, scoring 17 and winning by a single point, 417 to 416 when all was said and done. So a little bit closer than Brig, but it still would have won. The third winning play I had is actually in the same spot. It's a slightly more drawn out sequence, starting with Bong for 27, making Nub and Tau. Now, with IRZ, I am threatening to go out with Grizz from the G in Bong, so this is a little bit of a setup play. And Ian must block that if he wants to have a chance. I'll let you guys check the math that if Ian plays Gaib as he has been all along, and I go out with Grizz from the G and Bong, I'm going to end up winning the game by 7 points. So Ian's best try is Gaib over here from the G and Bong, blocking Grizz for 15, and bringing the score to an 11-point advantage for Ian. I can't go out now, but what I can do is score 24 with Tiz, keeping just the R. And this is going to be enough, because I take a 13-point lead here, and Ian can't get enough points going out with GT to make up for it. His highest scoring outplay is Teg for 6 through the Ian Varlets, and this would result also in a 5-point win for me, this time 420 to 415. Now, that being said, this is a much more complicated win to calculate, as it requires an out in 3 instead of an out in 2. It requires much more advanced and precise calculation to try to figure out what Ian's best block is and really be certain he doesn't have a better outplay than Teg. So, to me, Grizz and especially Brig, the one I played, are much more easy wins to be confident in, especially under a time crunch in such a stressful situation. So, like I said, Brig is the line I went with. Ian played Gaib. I went out with Zona and won this game 421 to 416. And what a game it was. Back and forth the whole way. Ian with a bit of a rough start with all those fouls. He drops Varlets to take a lead. I very nearly miss Anti-Fog after seeing the word immediately, just not noticing the spot for over 2 minutes. I finally see it, get it down, get another bingo. Ian is down about 50 after I bingo with Marvelers. He claws his way back to a lead, so much to the extent I feel forced to trade and go all out for a bingo. I finally hit my bingo, take a lead, then he comes right back with Compend for 51, and I'm all panicked in the endgame, down to about 3 or 4 minutes, mistracked, and I managed to track properly and eke out my win with Brig. With, I think by the time all was said and done, I had somewhere around 30 or 40 seconds left on my clock. If I had gone overtime, I would have lost, because that's a 10-point penalty. So instead of winning by 5, I would have lost the game by 5. So super wild stuff. So many clutch moments for me this game. To me, this game really felt like so many miracles had to happen. So many things had to go right for me to win this game. I had to see Anti-Fog after coming so dangerously close to missing it. I had to draw into Castrate after that exchange, which I still believe is the correct play, but will probably remain a play that's talked about and remain questionable until the end of time. And then after that, I had to draw good enough tiles to beat Ian in the endgame after his 51-point play of Compend, and not only that, I still had to figure out my winning sequence and track properly all in time. So just so much to unpack this game. I probably didn't even do full justice to it, and this is already a 45-minute video, but yeah, this was just an incredible game all around. So well played, I think, on both of our ends. The one move I think was a mistake for sure on my end was Feed. That should have likely been Fjord, but Ian played basically flawlessly. Other than that turn, I think I played pretty much flawlessly as well. Just an absolute banger of a game in every possible way, and I really needed this win too. If I had lost this game, then Ian would have won the title, taking the series 3-1, so this was a must-win for me, and thankfully I was able to deliver in an absolutely remarkable fashion here to tie the series up 2-2 and force a decisive Game 5 for all of the marbles. And if you guys think this game was entertaining, then be prepared and fasten your seatbelts for Game 5, because Game 5 was one of the craziest games you'll ever see. This one was also one of the craziest games you'll ever see, but Game 5 may have been crazier. I'm not sure whether it was crazier. You guys will have to decide once it goes up tomorrow, but it was crazy. That's all I'll say for now. Some of you have probably already seen it, but if you haven't, then be prepared for tomorrow's video, because it was a wild ride in Game 5 to determine who was going to be the champion. Neither of us knew until the very last second. So tomorrow is a video you definitely, I promise, do not want to miss. But that's all for now today, guys. Let me know, as always, what you think of this game. The turn, as I mentioned before, I'm especially curious to hear all your thoughts on is that pivotal exchange when I traded GGZPR to the bag, keeping RT, and managed to draw Castrate to bingo a turn later, which got me back into this game. Do you think I was right to exchange? Am I crazy? Should I have just played Gur? Like I said, the computer has it about even. I've had some top experts tell me I'm insane. I've had some top experts tell me I'm an absolute genius. So I don't know, and like I've said before, we may never know. But as always, all opinions are welcome, so if you have any instincts or thoughts on that position, positive or negative, I promise I will not be offended. Let me know what you think. That's it for this one, guys. Really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching, and please stay tuned for the decisive Game 5 tomorrow. It's going to be quite a game and quite a video. You won't want to miss it. Take care, everyone. Thanks again. Bye-bye.